Hello, welcome from New Delhi, and it's very lovely to see all of you here. We are just going to give it a little bit more time to maybe allow a few more people to join in, but it's very good to have everyone here. Thank you for coming. Just giving it a little time in case there are some latecomers, some stragglers. Hi once more to everybody who's coming in now, and we should be starting in just a few moments. All right, I think we are good to go. So, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who's here, and it's a real pleasure to be able to join you. As a matter of fact, if it hadn't been for this new life of ours, we would probably not have been in touch. But now that communicating over the screen has become such an everyday affair, it's wonderful really to be able to meet and talk to people whom you would normally not be able to meet or meet only after a lot of difficulty. My name is Arunava Sinha. If you want to pronounce it the authentic Bengali way, then it would be Orunabho Shingo, but I'm going to spare you that. Arunava Sinha it is for most people around the world. And I live in New Delhi in India, but I am from Calcutta, which is a city in the Bengali speaking state of West Bengal. West Bengal is the western half of what used to be a larger entity called Bengal till 1947, when the partition split us into two countries. And West Bengal remained in India, and what was East Bengal then went over to Pakistan, and East Pakistan subsequently became Bangladesh, as you know, in 1971. So history stalks us wherever we go, and splits and joinings and breakups seem to be so much a part of our collective history that it's very difficult to get away from them. It's of great joy to me that the English translation of Dozakhnama is now actually available to readers in Pakistan. It's been published by Liberty Publishers, and it's the greatest thrill for me that readers in Pakistan can buy and read the book. And I have to tell you that the kind of response that I've seen to the book on social media, especially Twitter and Instagram, has been so fantastic that it's got a new lease of life over the past couple of years. It was published in India several years ago, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, I think, or seven maybe. But it's completely taken on a new life, and in some way, it seems to have been um, accepted and taken in by readers in your country as your own book, and nothing could be greater than that. Um, Before we start actually talking about Dozakhnama, there is a short passage I'd like to read to you from another book. This is also written by Rabi Sankar Bal, the Bengali writer who wrote the original version of Dozakhnama, which has been translated into English, and I believe has been or is being translated into Urdu as well, the language in which it should originally actually really have been written, I suppose. Had Rabi Shankar Bal known Urdu, I'm sure that's the language he would have chosen to write it in. But sometimes things come home in roundabout ways. But I'm going to read to you from his last novel. It is very sad that Rabi Shankar Bal cannot be here with us because he passed away some time ago of liver complications. So in a sense, his life echoed his death at least echoed or followed Manto's death. But Rabi Shankar Bal's last novel was about Shehrazad. It was in Bangla. It's called Kissa Kahan Shehrazad, so which roughly translate into Shehrazad tells stories. And I'm going to read you a short passage that I translated from that book. And in some way, it sets the theme for what Dozakhnama is, although it came afterwards. but I'm very pleased to be able to share some of his words, which are not available anywhere except in the original Bangla book right now. Sherazad felt a sense of grief every time she viewed Sophie Anderson's painting these days. Sophie had painted it sometime in the middle of the 19th century. Although she didn't enjoy it, the painting drew Sherazad to itself again and again. The youth and beauty, the gaze suspended like a boat drifting in mid-river at a moment she had forgotten her own existence, were not things she would regain. Her skin had turned slack, her face was filled with creases of time, all her hair was white. She panted after a few steps, but Sherazad could not accept any of these as inevitable. Perhaps she had expected to remain as eternally ageless as the stories she had told the Sultan during the 1001 Nights. But she didn't even remember those kissas properly these days. Many of the dastans had slipped out of her memory altogether. One day she had realized that just like the stories that flow away, humans too become old as they sail along the currents of time. I am now journeying towards my wedding night with the hope of consummation with my lover. Sherazad sat in her head and laughed to herself. The eunuch at the gate informed her of the Sultan's arrival. Shahryar arrived shortly. Smiling, he said, "And what are you doing in front of the mirror, Begum Sahiba?" Looking at a mask. Sherazad was gazing at her own reflection. A mask? Where is it? Where did you get a mask? Right there. Sherazad pointed to the mirror. But that's you. The Sultan sat down next to his wife and looked into the mirror. It's a mask now. It's no longer my face. To me, your face is just as beautiful as ever. Sultan Shahryar put his arms around his wife. You see me as I was in the past, or else you'd have realized spring has left the garden long ago. Sherazad smiled. What made you think of me tonight after such a long time? I want a kissa tonight, just like before, all night long. But I've forgotten all the stories. Dunyazad can tell you the tales now. That is true, but the way you become one with your stories, they seem to be drawn from your own life. Dunyazad cannot do that. Yes, Sherazad had lived in her kissas and stories since childhood, and the books she read, commentaries on the lives and reigns of kings and emperors. She had collected several thousand books on ancient races and dead monarchs, philosophy, science, poetry. She had left out no kitab. But to what purpose? All of it was going into oblivion. A few days ago, she was reminded of a fragment of a share by Mir Taki Mir. She couldn't for the life of her arrive at the whole thing. What agony it was! The tortured feeling of seeing a familiar face whose name you cannot recollect. 2 days later, the neighing of a horse from the stables reminded her. Pain and separation, desire for my lover, thirst for ardor, with a raging storm I left for my grave. I too will leave with a storm raging in my heart, Sherazad told herself. The Sultan watched the reflection speaking to itself. Signs of old age. Everything could not be said openly anymore, only to oneself. He did it too. Let us go, Sherazad said. We shall sit in the Kitab Khana. Why the Kitab Khana? Didn't you want to hear a kissa? But you've forgotten them. The Sultan sounded aggrieved. Putting a hand in his, Sherazad said, What if I tell you a new one? Have you made up a new kissa then? Do you think anyone makes up kissas, Sultan? They're born and they die around us all the time. People choose the ones they like. But Sherazad didn't say any of this. The word maker had told her, never talk of the mysteries from which stories are born. Stories survive for thousands of years on the water from the mountain springs of enigmas. So that to me in so many ways sums up the way the stories in Dozakhnama that are nested within themselves and that swirl around in all kinds of shapes and come back and go away. That to me is how stories came to Rabi Sankar Bal as well. He didn't sit down to write every morning and said, "Today I will construct something." He was he was a he was a troubled man. He had he had to hold a job like everybody else, but that was not who he was. He wanted to be a writer. He wanted to be a poet, and he wrote a great many books. He wrote a great many, well, not too many, but he wrote some short stories and some poetry as well. But he was really a poet in prose, and that was all he wanted to do. And the world he wanted to inhabit, the world indeed he inhabited, was not just the world around him, but it was the world around him in which every year perhaps of history from his own past, of history from the collective past of the culture all of us belong to, and from elsewhere in the world. every part of that history was very much present in his own life. And late at night, he would occasionally send these text messages to me. And I could tell that he was both in agony and in ecstasy. Ecstasy because he had more stories to tell than he knew he could write. His failing health was preventing him from writing as much as he wanted to. And the last book that he was actually planning to write was going to be a biography, well, a fictional biography of Muhammad. And I was so looking forward to that book, but of course it never came to be, and perhaps it was never meant to be. So it's fitting maybe that he did not write it. But he wrote this book, Dozakhnama. He says, after the stories of Manto and the poetry of Ghalib live within him for over 20 years. He lived with them, he read them, he translated them into Bangla. And at some point, he became so involved with them that a novel grew around it. And in his head, he found himself, he told me, he said he found himself conversing with the two figures, Manto and Ghalib. And then he said, what if I step out and let them talk to each other? That was how Dozakhnama was born. And as those of you who've read it, and perhaps those who have not read it but who might read it, will realize that it is, of course, it is the story of these two people's lives, these two artists' lives, but it is also the history of our land, the land that all of us belong to. It is the history of our land about 150 years or so apart, but or maybe a little, 1857 on the one hand and 1947. Yeah, so less than that. Maybe about 100 years, 90 years apart. And yet, so similar, so much the same stories, so much the same history over and over again. And that is how this Dastan, if I may call it that, was born. He wrote it in Bangla because that was the language he wrote in, and that was the only language he was used to writing in. Although he read in three languages, he read in Bangla, English, and Hindi. But he wrote it in Bangla, and yet it never felt like a Bangla novel to me when I was writing it. It was written in a language that I could not quite put my finger on. And I think that had I known Urdu, perhaps I would have found it more similar to Urdu than to Bangla. Perhaps. Those of you who've read the translation can tell me if that is the case, whether the English seems to you to have some relationship with Urdu, because he was quite obsessed with Urdu. And as you can see, one of the things he does in the novel is talk about how he engaged someone to teach him Urdu. So those are the insertions he makes where he puts in a figure of an author in there. So this book came out in Bangla, and it immediately created a sensation among the Bangla reading public. Nobody had read anything quite like this. And even today, I don't think too many of us have read a book quite like this, structured quite like this, talking of all the things that it does. So back then, it immediately became the subject of book reviews all over in newspapers, in magazines, and on the internet. So I've been translating Bangla fiction and poetry and a little bit of nonfiction since about 2008 on what I call an industrial scale. Before that, I used to be a journalist. I still am in a small way a journalist, and now I also teach creative writing at Ashoka University here near Delhi, where among the courses I teach is our translation courses. So back then, I was looking for books of all kinds to translate, and I would read the reviews assiduously. That was where I discovered Dozakhnama. And the moment I read that it was a conversation between Ghalib and Manto from their respective graves, separated physically by thousands of kilometers, but joined together in death and joined together in looking back on the collective history of our land, I knew that this book had to be something special. The review said as much, and all that remained for me really, I mean, I had pretty much decided right then that if I get permission, I'm going to translate this book. So I got hold of a copy of the book. I ordered it online and had it delivered. And it came, and I started reading it. And it took me about 20 minutes to decide that this is it. I'm going to translate this book. So I started working on it almost immediately. I dropped whatever I was translating then, and I started on this one, and it consumed me. If as readers you feel that you are immersed in it, can you imagine what a translator feels? Because a translator reads a text so closely, perhaps even more closely than the writer themselves. So I was consumed by this book, completely consumed. And like everybody else, I'd read a little bit of Manto in translation, well, some of Manto and a little bit of Ghalib. And Ghalib, as you know, of course, is you can hear Ghalib's shares on people's lips all the time. So Ghalib is a familiar idea, and yet not a familiar idea, because what we hear is barely plumbs the depths, as you know, of what Ghalib actually wrote. So I started translating, and I could barely eat or sleep. I mean, I had to do all of those, and I had a day job as well. But it was an extraordinary experience. And when I had about 3 or 4 chapters ready, I got in touch with publishers here, and I said, "Look, I have this fantastic book, and you just have to trust me on this one, but it is the most incredible thing." And I send them those 3 chapters, and I send them a short synopsis, although, as you know, you cannot provide a synopsis of this novel. So I send them a couple of paras on the concept. And the first editor that it went to, who was Meru Gokhale, she was at that point, Penguin and Random House had just come together. You know, they'd merged and they'd become a bigger company. And Meru Gokhale had come from Random House, and she read it, or did not even read it, I don't know, but she mailed back almost immediately saying, "Yes, we are going to publish this." So I was very happy to know that. And then that was it. We went ahead, I translated the book, and it took a fair amount of time. I mean, I translate very quickly normally, because I find that when I'm in the flow, I don't really like to stop and do other things. So but even so, it took me some time, and I remember we went a family holiday to Italy that year, and I was translating right through that holiday because I could not bear to be away from the book. So surreptitiously, I would sneak away and open the PDF on my computer screen and pretend to be catching up on my email, and I'd work late at night or very early in the morning. So the book stayed with me till I finished, and it took me about 4 months to complete the first draft, and then it took me about another month to revise it and bring it to a point of completion. And then I sent it off to the publisher, and they duly published it after doing whatever they had to, all that they had to it. And when I read it now, when I go back, I can't read it. I can't bear to read it almost, because it's very difficult to read your own words. And when I read it, I realize that perhaps I would have translated it differently today, 5 or 6 years later, or 7 years later, because I just have a different approach both towards translation and towards this particular book. But I can't say I'm unhappy with the way the book is, nevertheless. Somehow that intensity remains, and that intensity comes back and strikes me every time I dip into it and read a little bit here and there. And one of the things that it made me think about was the fact that the partition is such an event in all our lives. Although maybe our generation and many of you who are younger than I am, obviously we have no direct first-hand experience of it, but it is so much a part of our life because it has come down to us. We have inherited it. We have inherited the after effects. We have inherited the trauma. We have inherited the sense of psychological split. And yet when we think of partition in literature, or even partition in cinema for that matter, we tend to think of only the partition on what is Pakistan's eastern border and India's western border, the Punjab and Sindh, the partition in Punjab and Sindh in that region, and Rajasthan in India, and for you, Punjab and Sindh. But we never think of the partition in the east, which is where I come from. And the partition over there led to exactly the same kind of exodus on both sides that happened. So people went from this side to that side, and people came from that side to this side, and it created exactly the same kind of trauma and exactly the same kind of displacement and the same kind of uncertainty as on the other border. So in a sense, for those of us who grew up in Bengal, we too have inherited the partition, even though it is less written about in literature and cinema. And therefore, I think our relationship to any art that brings the partition to it is visceral. It's very strong. We react to it with both head and heart in a way that perhaps people in other parts of the world, in other parts of South Asia, may not. And there are so many things when we read that we read here, when it comes to what Manto's life was like, the trajectory of Manto's life, the trajectory of Ghalib's life. And you feel, while you feel sad in a way, but you also feel blessed that we can count ourselves as inheritors of a legacy that artists like Mantu and Ghalib left behind for us. So for me, this book is just that. This book is a physical embodiment of a very significant part of the cultural history of who we are, and it just grows deep inside me. It grows in a way that I cannot explain. But I very often think about the two of them actually lying in their graves and in some mysterious way over the ether waves, talking to each other. And perhaps now, with what is going on now in our two countries, what do they do? I don't know. I would like to know. I would like Rabi Sankar Bal to come back and continue this conversation between them to tell us what they might be thinking about what is happening now, the things that are happening and the things really that should not have ever been happening. So I'm going to stop here talking about this book, and I'm happy to hear from you now. Thank you, Samir. I'm glad that you're enjoying it, and I agree that it is a book that needs to be read slowly, as Samir Ahmed says, reading slowly, absorbing it, loving it. Thank you for that, most of all, for loving it. So this book, by the way, yes, Samir says it's unlike anything I've read before. Oh, absolutely. And it's still unlike anything I've translated. And, I've translated almost 60 books, but I haven't translated another book like this one. Rabi Sankar Bal has also written a fictional biography of certain aspects of Rumi's life, which has also been published in India. So that's an interesting book as well. Shiroz Mahmood asks, what is your number one tip for new translators? Translate a lot. Don't worry too much about the whats and the hows and the whys. Just start translating. It's like singing. The more you do it, the better you will get at it. But translate a lot, translate everything, and listen to what you're translating. Let the original text play in your head and listen to your own translation as well. If those two things do the same thing for you, if they have the same effect, then you're there, and you'll get better and better at that game. Muniba asks, why did I choose this particular book to translate? This is a book, frankly, if you come across and you read a few pages, you will want to do something with it. You will want to bring to it whatever art you have at your disposal. The only art I have at my disposal is translation, so I translated it. I imagine if it comes into the hands of a filmmaker, they might want to make a film out of it. As a matter of fact, there has been a play. There's been a play in Pakistan, if I'm not mistaken. Lahore or Karachi, I'm not sure. I think it's been put on stage. And if you're a singer, you might want to sing parts of it or sing the shares or the ghazals that are mentioned there. So it's a book you respond to in some way with your own creativity. Zora asks whether things sometimes get lost in translation. If I had 1 rupee for every time someone's mentioned that phrase "lost in translation," I would really be a millionaire by now. So, things change in translation. I'm not sure if losing and gaining is the right parameter to put it in. But then things change in reading, more important than translation. The text might be the same, but each of us reads the text in a different way, in our own way. So yes, certainly what we read is not going to be exactly the same as what perhaps the writer intended. And certainly a new language will not accommodate everything the same way the original language did. If you want to use the word lost for it, you can, but then you must also use the word gained for it. Because just as a new language will not accommodate some things the way the original language did, it will also accommodate newer things which the original language could not. So net, if you have a good translator and a good translation, you will not lose anything. You may not have each and everything that's identical, but you're not going to lose anything. Hi, Huri, good to see you too, or at least good to see your question. Thanks for coming. Thank you. Huri says Dozakhnama is an absolute favorite. Thank you so much. Huri is one of Pakistan's most famous publishers. Lala and Fatima Rizvi is asking, do I plan on writing something currently? If you mean translating, yes, I'm translating all the time. I never stop translating. The novel I'm translating now is written by a writer from Bangladesh. She lives in Australia, and it's as far as different from Dozakhnama as can be, and yet it's similar in some ways. she has written a novel which is based on her own experience of psychosis and of being hospitalized for it. So yeah, if you mean, is it another novel about occupying an alternative reality? That's exactly what it is. Samir is back and says, one of the things that strikes me is the misery of both Manto's and Ghalib's lives. Yes. Was it ever depressing for you? Yes. I mean, when you start inhabiting their lives, you have no choice but to go through some of those pangs and their agony. But it was also uplifting because you realize that despite all of this, they produce such brilliant art. So in a way, it was a testament to what the human spirit and human abilities can achieve, no matter what your impediments are. So it was both depressing and uplifting simultaneously. And this book really has continues to haunt me in many ways, although it's been many years and I have the actual experience of translating it is no longer fresh in my memory, but the book lives inside me like a living entity in some way. I can't quite forget it. I mean, despite, as I said, close to 60 books in translation, this one just lives within me all the time. No two ways about that. So just to let you know that Liberty Books today and tomorrow is offering free delivery of its books. They're not going to charge you for delivering the books to your doorstep. So this is your time to order today and tomorrow anywhere all across the country, all across Pakistan. You can order Dozakhnama, you can order all their other books, and they will be delivered to you free of cost. So if I were you, I would totally take advantage of this. Thank you very much. It was really lovely being here, and we could have perhaps spent more time, and I would have loved to have actually seen all of you. And I look forward to a future when we will once again, people of our two countries will be able to meet freely and mingle freely and live our lives together. Thank you everyone for being here. Goodbye everyone.